Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the University of London Institute in Paris. My name is Adam Smith, and I have the pleasure of introducing to you several items, but most importantly, Chris Reed, who's going to be talking to you. Why am I here? Because I'm representing today the Association Française des Juristes d'Entreprise. So for those of you who are in-house lawyers, this is the In-House Lawyers Association in France. It represents your interests. And if you are an in-house lawyer in France, but you're not a member of the AFJE, we would like to know why. And you could talk to Charlotte about that. And I'm the old face of the AFJE because I'm an old man, but I'd like to introduce you to a young man.
Thank you. I'm Pierre Legui. I'm Pierre Legui, the representative of the younger section of the AFJE in Paris. So I'm very glad to be able also to introduce Chris Reed, and for the newer students that are looking for advice on careers as in-house consult, I'm more than happy to talk to you after this.
So the AFJE represents old people like me, young people like Pierre, right across the spectrum from junior in-house lawyers or even students at Master 2 level through to legal directors of companies like myself. So that's one thing to know about. Another thing to know about is the University of London Institute in Paris. What is it? We're in this building. What does it do? Well, most importantly, it does programs in LLM, Master's Degrees in Law, taught by Queen Mary University of London, and I think there's some documentation around the corner. So every year there are 2 intakes of people doing an LLM here. It's a full London-style LLM taught in 1 year, and you come out with a Queen Mary University of London degree. So those are 2 important things, but the most important thing is Professor Chris Reed, who's going to talk to you tonight about beyond Bitcoin, legal impurities and off-chain assets. And I hope he will explain what all of that means, because I don't understand it already. Talking to Chris outside, it became evident that Chris is perhaps even older than me, and he's been thinking and writing and researching about legal technology since before there was any legal technology, and so he is part of the Microsoft Cloud Computing Research Centre. He teaches at the Centre for Commercial Legal Studies, CCLS, at Queen Mary University of London, which I think you probably know has the premier, the leading technology law course at master's level of any UK university. And so plenty of experience to tell us not only about Bitcoin, but beyond Bitcoin. I'll hand over to Chris Reed. Thank you.
Shall I just briefly say, sorry, I forgot to say there will be drinks later, so please stay until the end.
Yes, there will be drinks at 8 o'clock. I will, if it looks like any danger I haven't finished by then, you should start making frantic gestures at me to say it's time to stop. Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming, and thank you to the association for helping organise this event. I am, as Adam said, Professor of Electronic Commerce Law. I've been doing this a long, long time. Scarily, we discover I've been doing technology law since just before Pierre was born. So that's a reasonable pedigree, and I still remember learning to program in 1975 using punch cards, which really dates me. Which makes it surprising I'm talking about blockchain and distributed ledger technology, but I've made vague attempts to keep up to date over the years. Why have I chosen the title? Well, obviously, everybody here has heard of Bitcoin. I'm guessing most people here are baffled a bit by Bitcoin. It's quite reasonable to be baffled. It's not a rational thing, Bitcoin, as I'll explain in a few minutes. But the other thing that you may have noticed, particularly if you're working in one of the sectors where this technology has grabbed people's imagination, say financial services, is that in those sectors there's a lot of excitement about all the other things we could do with this blockchain or distributed ledger technology. And those are two terms I'll use interchangeably. Blockchain, the kind of common usage, distributed ledger, technically more accurate, but blockchain is easier to say. So I'll talk mainly about blockchain. Right. And the reason it's interesting is because at the moment, blockchain is used for imaginary stuff, play money. Right. That's what Bitcoin is, that's what Ethereum is. All these things are nice things to play with. But if we're looking at it from an enterprise perspective, which is what in-house lawyers are interested in, they're not actually that interesting commercially. If you just take something like Bitcoin, for example, Bitcoin is so obviously not a payment system because it can do a few transactions a second. That's the maximum it can manage. Right. Visa processes thousands of transactions, tens of thousands of transactions a second. Yeah, as soon as you get that, you go, well, it's obviously not any kind of payment system. Right. But the technology underlying it is potentially really interesting for all sorts of things. And it becomes, I think, legally very interesting when we start to say what would happen if we used it to register, to record off-chain assets, real things, things that we're interested in. So some examples I'll be talking about as we go through could include land. Right. And if you think, who would use this weird techie stuff to register land? Well, the answer is Ukraine and Georgia are currently actually doing it, and a bunch of Latin American countries have been running pilots in it. Financial instruments, almost any financial instrument is a perfect candidate for blockchain technology. Practically everything, every document and every physical item in the international trade chain. So containers full of goods, stuff on ships, bills of lading, certificates of insurance, all those shipping documents and shipping things can be integrated via blockchain. There's a whole lot of interesting stuff that can be done. Right? But as soon as we start taking these real world things that are of major interest to us as lawyers, we discover that there are all sorts of interesting legal things that need to happen. Right? And those legal things change the technology or change how we can use the technology. So where I'm starting from is to say, if we look at Bitcoin, which we'll briefly do at the beginning, we'll see that from a technologist's point of view, it's a purely technological artifact. It doesn't do anything that's not technologically necessary to achieve what it wants to achieve. But if we want to put land or shares or bonds or certificates of deposit or cars or anything like that on the blockchain, and there I'll explain why we might want to do that, if we want to do those things, we need to introduce legal impurities into the technology. We need to change the technology in order to achieve the legal effects that we want when we're dealing in these off-chain assets. So my first slide, I thought, okay, how many really tech people have we got here? People who program in code and stuff like that, you know, 2, 3, 4. Okay, right. Please feel free to correct me if I'm very wrong here, but what I'm trying to do is to explain this at a very, very high conceptual level that lawyers can take in, because lawyers tend not to dig into the details of the code and how the thing is actually working. Right. And actually, having said, yeah, talk to me if you want, this is put together as a lecture, but I have no problem being interrupted. Feel free to stick your hand up at any point and say, look, can you explain that a bit further? Or what about X? You've forgotten something. I'm more than happy to do that. I'll even attempt to take questions in French, right? Though there is the danger that I'll go, okay, I was with you to comment, and then I lost it, and we have to carry on in English. But I'll have a go if you like. So yeah, feel free to interrupt me. If no one interrupts me, then I'll talk for about an hour, then we'll do question and answer. If you interrupt me, we'll have done the question and answer as we go. So that's fine. We'll stop at 8 either way, I promise, for the drinks. Right. So first thing then, how does blockchain work? Well, you need to know what a blockchain is. And a blockchain is very simply, it's just a record of entitlement to dispose of assets. That's all it is. Right. It's just a record of things about assets. Right? It doesn't just have to be the entitlement, as we'll see later on, but that's the most important thing. So think of it in terms of a land registry. What does a land registry do? It holds records of what the land is, a description of the land, its coordinates, whatever it might be, and most importantly, who has rights over that land. So it records the owner of the land, it records any person who has security interests, like a mortgage over the land, right? And that's really important. And then if you want to transfer the land, you have to make changes to the ledger, okay? So that's what this is, right? And the blockchain holds the whole history of the asset. So it holds the identity of the current holder and all the previous dealings in the asset. Now that in itself is, so what? Okay, we can do that on paper, we can do that in an ordinary database, there's nothing exciting about this. Right. Well, the second thing about it is that we don't just have one copy. Right. When you have a register like a land registry, you have one central copy of it, and everybody has to interact with the central copy. But here we have multiple copies that can be held widely across those who have interests in dealing in the asset itself. Right? And these multiple copies are synchronized with each other. So we don't have to change all the copies simultaneously. We change one, and then that change propagates across all the others. It's actually a bit more complicated than that, but that's the basic idea. Think of it like, you've got a Dropbox account? Right. So you change a file in your laptop and you're on the train and the Wi-Fi is not working, so nothing happens in your Dropbox account. Then you get to somewhere with Wi-Fi and your laptop speaks to Dropbox and synchronizes and shows that you've uploaded a new file and changed two of the files there. The same kind of synchronization is happening here. So these copies of the database gradually keep together. All right. And records of dealings are not added singly. They're grouped together in blocks, and then a block of records is all added together. And that's done for convenience of the synchronization process. If you updated every copy every time one record changed, that would be an awful lot of communication going on. So instead you put 100 or 1,000 records into a block and you update them all at once. Right. And this is where the clever stuff comes in, because using encryption technology, we link every new block to the preceding block. So every block has a technological link using encryption technology to the previous block in the chain. And what we can do is to use that to prove the integrity of everything in the blockchain. So long as the encryptions match up, so long as we can show the connection between the two blocks, we can connect the current block right back to the very first block, and we can prove that none of the old records have been changed. Because if any of the old records have been changed, then the encryption matching would no longer work. Right. Right. And then, of course, we have the question, okay, how do we decide which block to add? Because there might be competing blocks. We'll have more than, if this is a distributed network, it's not all happening in one place. So more than one entity might be making blocks and trying to add them to the chain. And we have something called a consensus protocol, which decides which is the block that gets added. And it's basically the earliest produced block. That's how it works. So if 3 people produce a block, each one of which could connect with the blockchain, the one that's earliest in time is the one that wins. The other 2 get thrown away, and then we just carry on making blocks. Right. This is where Bitcoin really gets confusing. Right. Because I've seen so many pieces written by lawyers saying, and of course, right, to make the blockchain work, to make it evidentially integral, we need something called proof of work. Right. BitChain has what are called miners, who are the people who make blocks. So you've heard about Bitcoin mining. Yes, this has been in the press so much for the last 3 months. Everyone must have heard of Bitcoin mining. All mining is making a block. Right. And to make a block in the Bitcoin system, you do a huge amount of completely pointless and unnecessary work. Right. The work you have to do to make a block has no economic value whatsoever. Right. But it takes a lot of computing resources, huge amount of computing resources to make a block. And the idea is that if you make people spend enough time and effort and money on making blocks, then they're not going to cheat because they've got too much invested in the system. That's the theory behind it. And it's also, the other reason for it is to keep the value of Bitcoin up. Because if anybody could make a block, anybody who makes a block gets awarded a Bitcoin. So that's why they make blocks. And if anybody could make a block in 2 minutes, there'd be millions and trillions of Bitcoins out there, and they'd be worth fractions of a cent rather than whatever they're currently worth, which I gather is half what they were worth last week. Right. So that's the confusing thing about Bitcoin, but it's completely unnecessary, except for Bitcoin. It's only necessary to give this asset some value and some scarcity. It's not necessary in any other system whatsoever. Right. If we're looking at off-chain assets, you wouldn't even think about mining. You'd use one of the 6 or 7 other consensus protocols that technologists have produced, and I'll talk about some of the things that we'd be looking for there later on. So that's how blockchain works. Any questions at this stage? Because if that was too complex, or no, it'd be my fault if it was too complex. If that's not clear enough for you to say, yeah, I think I know what's going on, then the rest of this is going to become increasingly difficult. Right. Everybody's happy. I see some grins and some concentrated faces. Nobody going, right, okay then. Right, let's move on to the next slide. And as we're going to get less formal now because this is tech stuff. So let's get rid of the jacket. Right. Let's look at Bitcoin. Right. Now, I said Bitcoin was odd, and it's not odd just because it does a whole load of technologically unnecessary stuff. It's odd because it pretends there is no law. Right. It's deliberately designed as something that should have no legal effects and no legal consequences whatsoever. That's the plan with Bitcoin. It is an anarcho-syndicalist technology. The aim is to make sure that nobody, particularly no state, but also nobody else can control the system, nobody else can tell who's involved in the system, nobody else can work out who is sending and receiving Bitcoins. The idea is to keep everything nice and quiet and secret. Yeah?
Yeah, but the miners, they have the power to, the miners, they have some kind of power. So it's against the freedom of idea of freedom.
Yeah, the miners have a high element of control in the network, but that's okay if there are enough miners. Right, okay. The miners don't know the identity of the people involved. So the miners only control the making of blocks, and the idea is that the system is they should compete with each other in cutthroat competition rather than cooperate. Right. The worry at the moment is it's become so expensive to be a successful miner that the numbers are dropping, and now it's quite possible for them to cooperate. That's one of the flaws with the concept behind Bitcoin. You know, when it was a nice little play currency worth $1 a time, then yeah, that was true. In the early stages, miners would genuinely compete. There were lots of them. There was lots of competition. That ensured the honesty of the system. But there is nobody overseeing this. There is nobody in charge of Bitcoin. Right? And the other thing, of course, is the asset we're talking about, the Bitcoin itself, is a pure artifact of the system. So if the Bitcoin system were destroyed, right, and you might say, how would that happen? Well, think about, say, the Stuxnet worm, which you may have heard of, which was let loose on the internet, infected Iranian plutonium processing technology, and broke it. Right. Nobody knows who made that, but it was obviously somebody who didn't like the Iranian government and the Iranian plutonium enrichment program. Right. That kind of technological attack could potentially destroy the entire Bitcoin system by if you just infect the software and make it start deleting all the copies of the blockchain. And once you've done that, there would be no Bitcoins. They'd disappear. Right. Now, of course, if we put land on the blockchain and the blockchain disappears, the land's still there. So that's one big fundamental difference already. Right. Right. And the second thing that is important about Bitcoin is the Bitcoin blockchain is the sole source of rights over the asset. There is no other way of acquiring rights on, to a Bitcoin other than to do a transaction on the blockchain. That's the only way you can become the owner of a Bitcoin. All the rights are on the blockchain itself. Because it's distributed, of course, there is no person against whom the law can enforce the rights. You can't go to the person who is in charge of the ledger and say, oh, make somebody give this Bitcoin to somebody else. Yeah, like a judge would. Judge would say, okay, you're registered as the owner of land, but I'm deciding that under the will, you're not in fact the owner, somebody else is the owner, therefore you must transfer ownership to the right person. And then, if necessary, an order can be given to the land registry that they change the register. There's nobody to whom that order can be given in the Bitcoin system. This is a whole bunch of people, thousands or millions of them, all with bits of blockchain held on their computers. And the thing is in multiple copies. And what this also means is that third-party claims are completely unenforceable. You can't take security over a Bitcoin because there is no way of enforcing that security. There is no way of making the Bitcoin be transferred to you. Right. Anyone who studied this will say, yes, but what about smart contracts? They are a piece of code that lives on the blockchain. They're part of the blockchain itself. So it all happens within the technology. Right. Now, if we move to off-chain assets, things are completely different because these assets exist outside the ledger as well. Right. Some of them have a physical existence. So we've got things like land, goods, cars, containers, cargoes of oil. Right. That's all real stuff, exists in the real world. And then we've got legal rights and claims, because an awful lot of assets only exist in the form of legal rights and claims. I've mentioned their bonds, shares, carbon credits as obvious examples for blockchain. Another one is intellectual property, which I hadn't mentioned. A lot of discussion about using the blockchain to record ownership of intellectual property rights and how they're transferred and who else has rights in them. Right. But these exist as legal rights and claims which are enforceable irrespective of where they're recorded. Right. They still exist in the world even if the original method of recording them or registering them ceases to exist. And because of that, law and regulation can act on the asset outside the ledger. So we can get court orders, we can have contracts, we can have physical things that actually happen. I don't know what the law in France is, but in England, if you come onto my land and fence it off and use part of it as your own for 12 years, then you can become the owner of that land, simply by possessing it against me for all that period of time. Right. Obviously in different countries. France may have nothing like that. I'm sure you have the system where if you take your car in to be repaired, that the mechanic who is repairing it can refuse to give it back to you until you've paid for the repair. So there we are. Because they have possession of the asset, they have rights over it. So with these physical things, law and regulation can give people rights over the asset. And in order to make these things work, if we want to continue to make these things work, we have to put legal impurities into the blockchain technology we're using. Right. So if in your organization some consultant is coming to you and saying, hey, you can use blockchain in your business, you can use it to record assets and do these brilliant things. And what we've done is we've taken the Bitcoin blockchain and we've just replicated it but for your assets, then as a lawyer you should be very suspicious. Because almost certainly that technology is not doing the things you need it to do. And it would help, I thought, if you understood what had to be done, which is the point of this lecture. So that's what it's all about. So before we start, one more foundational thing. If we say, as lawyers, if we look at a blockchain or any other technological record of something, and we say, what is it really, what's its most important function in legal terms? I would say its most important function is that it's evidence. That's what it does primarily. It's a bunch of ones and zeros, which, as far as the law is concerned, mean nothing at all, but lawyers are really interested in evidence. Right? And that's primarily what it's used for. It's used to evidence two things. One is attributes, so it tells you something about the asset or about the people involved. So it might tell you about people. Right? You might want to know who somebody is. More importantly, you might want to know about somebody. Like I don't know, you're doing a legal transaction and you're quite keen that the person on the other side is in fact a lawyer. Right. How do you know they're a lawyer? Well, we could record on the blockchain that so-and-so is a lawyer. Right. How would we know they were a lawyer? We'd need to get, I guess we'd get the bar to say they're a lawyer. So we'd record a third-party assertion about them that says this is them and they're a lawyer. Those are their qualifications. We might want to record that. Objects. This links in very nicely with the Internet of Things, which you may also have heard of. The idea behind the Internet of Things is that physical objects like laptops and watches, though not this very cheap watch, but slightly more expensive watches and all sorts of other things, have in them little chips, right, which uniquely identify them, and we can link those chips to networks through the Internet of Things concept. Right. Now that's quite interesting in the supply chain, for example, so that we would not simply record that there is a container of goods, but also we would record all the individual goods inside the container, because they all have chips that can talk to the blockchain and say, yeah, hello, yes, this is indeed a cargo of 30,000 t-shirts from China, and 20,000 of us are blue and 10,000 of us are white, right? Because we have all the records there, they're in. Right. Right. So we can get direct evidence about objects from the Internet of Things, right? And again, third-party assertions about them. So if we were, say, recording car ownership on the blockchain, it would seem very sensible also to put its maintenance record on, would it not? Right. So one of the things you would record is the maintenance record of the mechanic who said, I have performed this maintenance on the car. And guess what, of course, new parts would have been fitted. All those parts have chips, and through the Internet of Things, we capture that on the blockchain as well. So we could tell they were real parts and not counterfeit parts, which is quite nice if they're your brakes. It's very nice to have real brake pads and not counterfeit brake pads if you want to stop in a hurry. So attributes, that's something we'll record, but that's kind of one-time stuff and then keep adding as the attributes change. Legally, the most interesting bit is what I'm calling entitlement. Right? And I'm very carefully not calling it ownership. Right? Now, we talk as lawyers about ownership as shorthand, but as soon as we start to unpack ownership, we go, oh, God, ownership's really complicated. Right? Because we're not just interested in who has the legal title, who is the owner of something. We're interested in all the rights that every other person has in that item as well. And all these things we can think of as entitlements. So it's not just the right to dispose of the asset, which is all that is recorded for Bitcoin. That's all that's recorded. This person, and it's actually not even this person, the holder of this digital signature key has the right to dispose of this Bitcoin. That's all the Bitcoin ledger records. Right. But for, say, off-chain assets, you might want to record third-party rights and claims. Certainly if you were running a land registry, you'd say, okay, Chris Reed owns this piece of land, but Adam has granted him a mortgage, and Adam therefore has rights over the land. And by the way, Charlotte, his neighbour, has the right to run her sewage pipes under his land in order to reach the street and the main sewage. So we capture all those things in the record. Right. And also rights against others. You know, so I might have a right to be registered as the owner of the land if something happens. Adam has, he's given me a mortgage. If I don't pay him, he has the right to foreclose on the mortgage and become the owner of the land. Right. So we'd register that again in the blockchain. All these rights need to be put in there. And the whole thing is achieved in part through digital signatures, public key infrastructure signatures. I don't have time to talk about that today. That's a whole lecture in itself, but that's a fairly mature technology. The seminal paper that kicked this off, Reves, Chamir and Edelman's paper, is I think 1986, so that's 31 years old. The Signatures Directive is 2000 or 2001, so that's 16 plus years old. Yeah, this is stuff that's been around, and that the technology is mature, it's trustworthy. You can easily prove to a judge that a digital signature works. And that's how people identify themselves as being entitled to an attribute. So what Bitcoin does, Bitcoin runs its own digital signature infrastructure. If you get Bitcoin client software, then that software generates for you a digital signature. And then that signature is recorded in the blockchain, and then only the person who controls that signature, you, can dispose of the asset. That's essentially how Bitcoin is working. That's all that's going on. Now, there is a need, therefore, for some evidential legal impurities, or potentially, right? Because for off-chain assets, we probably can't use the blockchain to evidence all the rights we want to evidence without radical law reform. Right. For example, if we're going to record ownership of a motor vehicle on the blockchain, and we want to allow the repairer to continue to have this right to keep the car until you've paid for the repairs, then we will have to record that right on the blockchain. Otherwise, you can dispose of the car without giving effect to that person's right. So we'd be bringing the blockchain into all sorts of transactions that we might not want to bring it into. And you can see the difficulty of running a vehicle registration system which incorporates every motor repairer, everybody who might have an interest in a car. Rights via court orders. You know, suppose you acquire a right in something via a court order. We somehow have to be able to get that onto the blockchain. And at the moment, it just shows that the person with this signature has the entitlement to dispose of the asset. So if the court order says something different, we've got to change the blockchain somehow. Right? We've got to change the evidence. Right? And limitations on rights. There are often limitations on rights. There are things like, in the UK, you can put a caution on the land register. You can say, okay, this person owns the land, but I have possible rights in it which may or may not come to fruition, and I want to preserve them. This is particularly common in a divorce. Two people are getting divorced. The land is only owned by one of them. The other person is likely to be given some rights over the land in the divorce proceedings. They can enter a caution onto the land registry to make sure that the land isn't sold off and they lose their rights. And you know, the French system probably doesn't work that way, but there will be equivalents in all the French systems of registration. All these things happen outside ledger transactions at the moment. So either we have to make them happen on the ledger, or we have to make the ledger work with rights that occur outside the ledger. One or the other. Right. Bitcoin technology doesn't do that. Bitcoin says nothing happens outside the ledger. But in the real world, interesting things happen outside the ledger, and we want to capture them as lawyers. There is another point that you might want to think about as well, and that is that Bitcoin is very short-term technology. Bitcoin is really only interested in the last few months or the last year or so of transactions. So although the Bitcoin ledger goes right back to the creation of the very first Bitcoins, no one's interested in those because they move around so fast. Right. The current ownership of all the Bitcoins is recorded in the last few months of the ledger, pretty much, except for a few. One of my co-researchers from the University of Cambridge on the project, he owns a Bitcoin. Right. He's had it for years, but he's forgotten the password that will let him into his digital signature technology. He is now notionally, I don't know how many, 10,000 euros poorer than he was last week. But that was fine because he was then 10,000 euros notionally richer than when we first talked about this. And he still can't get the money. And he never will get the money because he can't remember his password. So he can't get in to get at it. So his coin hasn't changed hands for years. But all the ones that are live, all the ones where people haven't forgotten the passwords, have been traded in the last 6 months to a year. So it's only the last bit of the ledger that's of any interest to anybody in practice. That is not so with off-chain assets. People own land for years. People own shares long term. So the technology has to work long term. And the problem here we have is a thing called Moore's Law, which you might have heard of. A computer scientist called Gordon Moore invented this 20, 30 years ago, something like that. And he said, yeah, I think at a conference, he idly said, you know, it looks to me as if computer power seems to double every 18 months. Right, the same amount of power for the same amount of money. Right, so for €1, in 18 months' time, you get twice as much computing power. And that has held good for at least the last 30 years. And although physics keeps looking like it will defeat the hardware makers, they find ways to get around it, and it keeps increasing every 18 months. Right. What does that mean? Right. It means that public key digital signatures start to become vulnerable with time, right? Because they depend on encryption, and encryption depends on the mathematical proof that you cannot guess the encryption, you cannot crack it without spending an infeasibly large amount of computing time and money. Right? I can do the maths if you like, but no one wants that. I mean, it's, you know, we'll have to do drinks immediately afterwards. So let's just trust me on this, right? That we can prove with mathematics and experts that if you have enough computing power, you could break a digital signature, but the amount that's required is ludicrously big. So what happens is we set digital signature key sizes at a size that makes computation reasonably easy, but makes them very expensive to break. So let's suppose that we choose a key size, so it's going to cost 5 million euros a time to break a key. That sounds fairly secure. If we don't like that, we can make it 50 million or 100 million euros. But let's make it, for the purposes of my calculations, let's make it 5 million euros. Right. Now, Moore's law tells us that every 18 months, we have twice as much computing power for the same money. So in 15 years' time, we have 1,000 times as much computing power. Is that right? Yeah, 1,000 times as much computing power for the same amount of money. So our key, which was perfectly secure today, in 15 years' time will cost 5,000 euros to break. Now, you have a €500,000 piece of land. No one's going to spend 5 million euros to break the encryption on a key to get hold of your €500,000 piece of land. In 15 years' time, your land will be worth more. It will only cost 5,000 euros to break the key. So the historical data in the record becomes more and more insecure. That's fine. We can deal with that just by using more secure encryption early on, but that has to be budgeted for and built into the technology. And this is something that lawyers have to understand and tell their clients. You know, you can't just buy the off-the-shelf stuff and expect it to be working in the same way in 15 years. This long-term evidence issue is potentially very important. Right. The other stuff I don't think I want to talk about. That was there because when I first gave this presentation, there was a bunch of computer scientists in the room, and I wanted to try and test how easy it is to run countermeasures. And I think actually it's not bad. That last bit might be helpful because you've got the blockchain in multiple copies. Right? It's quite easy to forge, to break the encryption, let's say, and to forge an historic block in one copy. Right? But in order to get that to propagate across the network, you've got to manage to do that for over half of them. Right? So quite simply, if I forged one copy and I'm trying to sell the land to you even though I don't own it, all you have to do is to check 2 or 3 other copies of the blockchain. And if they don't match my record, then you know that my record is wrong. And it's very expensive for me to do the same thing for lots of copies. It's quite easy to do it for one, but harder to do it for lots. So that's something you might want to build in as a checking mechanism. Now, I'm not saying this works. I'm saying this is the kind of question you put to computer scientists. You say, how are you going to ensure that in 15 years' time, all the ownership rights here disappear because the fraudsters have got at the blockchain and corrupted it? Which I think is definitely a lawyer's question. And then you expect to get good answers from the techies. So we got these problems that we need to solve to make blockchain really useful for these off-chain assets. But there is no doubt that it is potentially really useful. If you think about the land registry example, and you say, well, why would Ukraine and Georgia have introduced a blockchain land registry to replace their old paper land registry? Why would they bother doing it? There are 2 reasons. One is that you don't have to buy an expensive centralized computer system. Right? With distributed technology, lots of cheap computer systems can run it, and what's more, all the players, all the notaries and lawyers and mortgage companies run it on their own systems for free. So you actually get to use everybody else's computing power rather than paying for an expensive central system. So that's a good thing. And the second thing, which is the real driver in both Ukraine and Georgia, is that if you have corruption in the system, and apparently they have endemic corruption in land dealings in both those countries, with notaries making huge amounts of money out of false documents, the only way to drive corruption out of the system is to have a register which cannot be changed technologically. So that's the second driver. And that's a huge social gain. If you can drive corruption out of the system, get rid of fraud. I'm actually working with a project with one of our researchers at Queen Mary at the moment, looking at the energy supply chain, the whole of the energy value chain, and sustainability. There is a huge push to try to make the whole energy supply sustainable. At the same time, there's huge amounts of ignorance about everything in the supply chain. So, you know, just as an end consumer, you go, yes, I'm going to be really green. I'm going to put solar panels on my house. I'm going to generate my own energy and supply it back to the grid. And then someone comes along and says, okay, the rare earth minerals that make up your supply chain, did they come from a war zone? Were they mined by slave child labor? Right. Did they produce huge toxic environmental effects? You don't know. Right. These are things we can capture in the supply chain and thus attempt to improve sustainability through transparency. So we're actually running a research project just looking at that right at the moment. Lots of good reasons why you might want to do this. Yes?
Excuse me, what I do not understand is...
Sorry, can you shout a bit? There's a fan behind me.
What I do not understand is where the blockchain are hosted. Because you say that you need to have expensive data centers.
Yeah. Okay, no, that's the whole point. They're not hosted in expensive data centers. Right. Yeah. Anybody who wants a copy, anybody who's part of the system can have a copy and hold it. And then the copies keep getting compared with each other. Right. So if it's a land registry system and you're a lawyer who deals in land sales for clients, you can have copies on your system. You could be generating blocks, potentially, if the system is designed that way. And you haven't got to do it quickly. You know, for off-chain assets, it's not as if we have that they're necessarily very time sensitive. For a land sale, yeah, does it matter if it takes 10 seconds or 10 microseconds to complete the transaction? Not really. Okay, 10 seconds is good for a land sale. Right. For a share registration, yeah, for share dealings, buying and selling shares, we want instantaneous stuff because there's money to be made out of that tiny momentary arbitrage if you get a fraction of a second advantage. But for the ultimate registration of ownership, well, it could take a week. I mean, on a paper system, it does take a week. That's fine. We can live with that. Okay. For off-chain assets, they don't change hands fast enough for the speed of recording to matter that much. So distributed ledger is ideal because you don't need high processing power for speed. You can do slow processing. And storing, I mean, the whole Bitcoin blockchain is, I don't know, can't remember how big it is, 4 gigabytes, something like that. So it'll fit comfortably on a laptop hard drive, modern laptop hard drive. You wouldn't want it there because it would get in the way of your videos and things, but you could have it if you wanted. Yeah, the whole of a land registry, oh, that's small. Right, that would be half the size, I should think, for France. Would grow a bit over the years, but it would be about half the size today. So we're not talking huge volumes of stuff. Does that answer your question? Yeah, good. Right. Okay. Let's move on then. So we've got these yes?
So who owns the blockchain? Because there are different blockchains.
Right.
And if you can offer it as a commercial service, there will be one owner of the blockchain, I guess.
Okay. If you're running a distributed blockchain, a distributed ledger using blockchain technology, right, then talking about who owns it is just not a relevant question. Right? It is made, lots of people are involved in adding to it, they share copies of it, they compare them, they throw away bits, they agree on which is the right bit. Right? It's just out there. Right? Somebody obviously controls the design of it, but again, once you've got it started, you can't change the design easily. Okay? Somebody controls the software that is used to integrate with it. That's the biggest point of interest. That's the biggest point of failure. So that's an interesting question. As to, you know, if this is purely proprietary technology, how can we trust it? And one of the normal ways of trusting it is to say, actually, we'll make it a collaborative enterprise. And in fact, if you look at the Bitcoin software, it is open source software. So anybody can contribute to the design, but only good changes get accepted by enough people to make it into the final version. However, having said that, they then have fights, because techies have fights, like academics and practicing lawyers, and they split into rival groups. So Bitcoin has split quite a few times, and there are 3 or 4 rival versions running at the moment. There was a hand there somewhere, yeah.
You were quoting as countries Georgia and Ukraine, if I'm right.
Yeah. Yes.
So in these countries, for instance, who has designed the software and who controls the software?
Okay, ultimately in those countries, central government, because they are replacing a central government function. So their blockchain doesn't work in anything like the way the Bitcoin blockchain works. And they've literally just started, and I haven't had the chance to dig into it, hampered by the fact that both the Georgian and Ukrainian languages are not languages of which I have any mastery whatsoever. So I'm kind of waiting for information to come out about them to understand them a bit better. Yeah. And there's no reason why it has to be distributed. You could run a central database using blockchain technology. Right? But at that point, you lose a lot of the advantages of using blockchain. You might, if you're going to run a central database where a trusted government entity is running the database, why not use simpler technology like a database? Yeah, you know, because at that point we're actually relying on the entity to prove the records are accurate and haven't been changed. And if we can rely on them anyway, why do we add in all the extra encryption and other stuff? Yeah.
This is that you cannot change it on the blockchain. You cannot change the information. Whereas even if you trust the entity, you know that an entity, a people is, how to say, corruptible.
Yeah, well the thing is, it's not that you can't change the information on the blockchain. It's when it's distributed, you can't change it without people noticing. Because there are other copies out there and they don't match anymore. Right. If it's all under one person's control, they can just change it. Yeah. Encryption makes it more difficult, but not impossible. And if you happen to have designed the encryption technology because you control the whole thing, you build in a little back door that just lets you change things. You know. So if you want, yeah, that's the difference. In a closed system, it doesn't really matter what you're using. It might be efficient to use blockchain, it might not. But that's just a pure technical efficiency question, really. It's not even an evidential question. You know, if it's a land registry and they control it all, what you're relying on is the land registry telling you this is the position. Yeah? And if the land registry is corrupt, it doesn't really matter what technology they're using. Okay. If, on the other hand, you're not relying on a central organization to hold the database and give evidence about it, you're relying on comparing copies to make sure they're all the same, right? Then you need the encryption technology built in to make it so difficult to change that we can always spot changes by comparing different versions. You're not 100% convinced. Okay, over drinks we can argue. How about that? Yeah. The rest of you, just trust me on this. I know I'm right, but I recognize there's just a faint possibility. No, there isn't. Okay. Okay. Why have I got this slide? Again, this was aimed more at the technicians, but interestingly, I see this in an awful lot of technology that comes along. They say, this is great. We got a technology that is brilliant. It's going to do exactly what you want. It's going to solve, amongst other things, all your legal problems in area X. Data protection is a good one. You know, I'm sure that with the GDPR coming out, there are lots of companies out there saying, I have a software solution for you. Right, buy my software solution and it will just solve all your data protection problems. Right. Now, I've done quite a lot of work with techies. I spent 3.5 years on a EU-funded project led by Hewlett-Packard, whose idea was that it would produce transparency in cloud computing for data protection. So there would be tools that enabled everybody involved to be sure that they were complying with their legal obligations. Right. And the first 2 years were spent trying to explain to techies why I couldn't give them a statement of the law that they could code. And the only way I proved it to them was I gave them a statement of Article 25 of the Data Protection Directive. I actually set it out as a flowchart. And I said, okay, and this is the point where the flowchart says, if your lawyer says you are compliant with this requirement, then you can go to the next stage, otherwise you go somewhere else. There is always something that doesn't really fit into coding. For example, think about fraud. Right? Now, every legal system has this. You have a transaction procured by fraud. In certain circumstances, the law gives you a right to go to the courts and ask for that transaction to be reversed. And in fact, sometimes it means the transaction never happened, doesn't it? So there was enough fraud that ownership never passed. Okay? Now, let's suppose we want to code fraud into it. And we're talking Bitcoin, yeah, company shares, high value stuff. So fraud is a distinct possibility. Right. What is fraud? Well, it's based on two things, on the intention of the person who's committing the fraud. Right. So we need to capture someone's intention. Right. That always defeats computer scientists. You say, okay, build me a tool to capture someone's intention. And they go, Oh, no, a helmet, you know, a shiny thing with sensors. Not easy, right? And it also depends on the subjective state of mind of the victim. Right? Yeah, if I'm not fooled, it's not fraud. Right? If I am fooled, it is fraud. So what's my subjective state of mind? Okay, second helmet with different technology to work out what's going on in my mind. Right? And we keep hitting that kind of thing in law. Law is full of stuff like reasonable care. And lots of French law has reasonable care in it, doesn't it? Everybody's law has reasonable care in it, or best efforts, or acting ethically, or you have, contracts, performing contracts in good faith. All right, that's great. Now imagine trying to sit down and describe good faith to a computer scientist so they could code good faith. Right. Yeah, we all know what it means. We work with it day in, day out. Well, I don't, but you guys do. You know what good faith means, but you can't actually explain it. It's just one of those things that you know because it kind of emerges from your interactions with other lawyers as to what good faith means. So there's a whole lot of non-codable stuff. Right. In fact, I've also been in work on artificial intelligence, and there are ways in which we can capture these things with technology, but the problem is the ways that we can use to capture them aren't then explainable. We just say technology says you were deceived. Okay. How do we know that? Technology says so. We can't explain it. Right. It's a thing called a neural network. It just works. So now it's trust the computer. Yeah. So there's real problems that we can't do what the technologists would like to do. We can't just say let's change the code to capture all the legal requirements. And we can see this if we look at the most important things we'd need to build in. And I thought you'd like to know about these. And I've tried to pick areas of law that you might well be working with on a regular basis. Right. So the two things I think that are most important and that we currently don't have in Bitcoin type technology are firstly identity disclosure. Right. Bitcoin is, well, they often call it an anonymous system. It's not strictly speaking anonymous, but it is the person who holds this key is the person who can dispose of the Bitcoin. Right. That's all that is recorded. There is no link recorded between the key and the real world identity of the person who holds it. Now that's fine in a Bitcoin type system, anarcho-syndicalist, let's have a currency or asset outside the state. Right. But if you are spending $10 million on a cargo of oil, right, wouldn't you like to know who's selling it to you? Just commercially, you'd be quite keen to know who's selling it to you. And not even just commercially, you'd have a load of legal obligations, your organization would. You know, like your accountants will be coming to you and saying, how are the auditors going to cope? Right. We bought a whole tanker full of oil from Digital Signature, this number. Right. How are we going to put that into the accounts? How are we going to kind of justify that? We've got stuff like not financing terrorist organizations. How do we know we weren't financing a terrorist organization? We've got no idea. We don't know who it was. Okay. So people need to know. And if you're in a regulated sector like financial services or pharmaceuticals or anything like that, the regulator likes to know who you're playing with. Right. It likes to know who your counterparties are. That's very important. Yeah.
Isn't the point of, Malta or places like this to hide economical activities? You have multiple ways. I mean, Bitcoin is just one way.
Yeah.
If you hold a lot of assets, you would have to want to hide it,
No, if you want a technology to help hide assets, this is a good technology. Yeah, if you design it that way, yeah. Of course, but the question is that how your company runs? I have a suspicion that most of the organizations here, maybe even yours too, doesn't hide its assets in that way. I don't know where you're from. Should we ask? Can we ask him where he's from? Do you want to say where you're from? Do you want to keep quiet?
I live in Paris.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, but you get the point. That if you want to do this, if you have a need to do this, to be honest and open, then you actually have to know who you're dealing with. Right. And the other thing is that we're going to have to make changes to the ledger that aren't made by transactions between the parties. Because, for example, suppose that someone commits fraud on me and I transfer my shares to them under fraud, and then I get a court order ordering that they be transferred back to me. Now, the one thing I'm pretty certain of is the fraudster is not voluntarily going to transfer them back to me, right? Because the fraudster has run away with the proceeds, right? So I need the company registry to change the ownership from whoever's now got the shares to me, right? We've got two innocent people, both victims. We've got me and the person who bought the shares, right? One of us has to suffer. The court decides it's the other person, not me. We now have to change the register. But the fraudster's gone, and they've got the digital signature key. So how do we do it? Okay, we have to be able to make changes to the register. And also there are lots of legal reasons why somebody might have a need to delay or prevent a transaction, right? Particularly under money laundering laws. I'm going to talk quite a bit about money laundering because that is of interest to almost everybody in this room. Am I right? How many of you have money laundering issues to worry about in your company? Yeah, quite a lot of you, yeah. And the lawyers, of course, private practice lawyers are entities to whom money laundering laws apply. So private practice lawyers really worry about money laundering, and it impacts them on a daily basis. Okay, so think about identity, right? For blockchain transactions, the identification is private keys, digital signature keys, right? Private and public keys. The public key is recorded in the register. You own the private key. Only by using your private key can you make a signature that matches the public key. That's how the technology works. Right. You have to trust them. No further identification is technologically necessary. But there are often legal requirements to record real-world identities, like a land registry. A land registry doesn't just record somebody owns this land, it records the name of the person who owns the land. Right. That's a legal requirement. So we have to capture their real-world identity, or we have to change our land registration laws to say we don't care who owns the land. We just, so long as they have a digital signature that matches, that's good enough. Same thing with company shares, certainly under English law. And if you think about why you want to know who owns company shares, well, you want to know about things like concentrations of ownership, you have an antitrust interest, you have company law rules about controlling interests and, what are they called? Financially significant persons. There's something or other. I'm one anyway because I'm one of the shareholders in my gliding club's company, which has 13 shares and I own 6, and therefore I'm a minority shareholder, but I have significant control over the thing. So I have to have my name on the register to show that I'm that kind of person. We're just changing it so everyone has one share, and then we haven't got to do that anymore. All right. But those kind of things, and there are lots of socially significant and legally important reasons for knowing who a person is, which don't exist in the Bitcoin type blockchain and need to be built into a blockchain that's going to work in this way. Certainly, if we're looking at financially significant transactions, somebody involved in the transaction has a money laundering interest. If it's not your company, it's your bank, which is financing the transaction. And your bank won't finance it if the money is going to an anonymous person in an unknown location. Right. That is not going to fly. So your company cannot do any business with people who don't disclose their identity enough to the banking system to meet money laundering requirements. Right. Now currently we put money laundering obligations on intermediaries, and the identification stuff is called Know Your Customer. If any of you have done private practice law, as I've done some, you'll have come across this. You get a new client, and the firm is busy celebrating, and then someone says, it's your job to do the money laundering stuff. And you have to go and persuade the client to give you a copy of their passport and fill in forms and do things the client doesn't want to do. And you can't do any transactions through your firm's bank account with their money until you've done it. And it's all a complete pain. And it takes a long, long time. All right. So, you know, money laundering is important, plus it's a criminal offence not to do it right. So that's slightly significant to all of us here. We're quite interested. And the other thing, of course, is that then you say, all right, we're going to identify somebody. Now, even in the real world, it's quite difficult to identify somebody. Because, I have a question for you. How do you know I'm Chris Reed? How do you know I'm me? Yeah. Well, I wrote it on the slides. Adam told you, but I told him who I was. Yeah? Yeah. But Anna Gray confirmed it. So Anna told Adam that I'm me. Right? And Anna first met me in the offices at Mile in our offices in Lincoln's Inn Fields in London, in the Centre for Commercial Law Studies there, and I looked like I worked there, and people seemed to know me. So in fact, it's a whole load of, there's a whole load of third-party assertions that prove who I am, right? And you have to trust somebody. So you were trusting Adam until I told you that he didn't know me until I arrived, and then Adam's trusting Anna, who has known me longer, and Anna's trusting other people who've known me longer. So possibly I've got away with it all these years. You know, I got the job under this name, and I've made something of a success of it, I guess. But you see the problem. The whole of identifying somebody is based on third-party assertions. You know, you say, yeah.
But under the blockchain, isn't it possible to properly identify data under the control of the user instead of third persons?
I'm coming to that next slide, if that's okay. Is it? Yeah. No, the slide after. Okay, but I'm coming to that in a couple of slides. That's okay. The answer is maybe. Yeah. There's only one point on it, but I've got a whole section in my paper on it which you can read. Okay. So that there is a problem with this, because we now have a distributed system where the data is floating about all over the place. How can we trust these third parties? Yeah. So even if you've got a government authentication, like a passport or identity card, and we've turned that into electronic form, right, how do you trust that? Well, the answer then, interestingly, is digital signatures. So if you're an Estonian citizen, you have an identity card which has a digital signature in it and gives you a digital signature, and you can use that in transactions to identify yourself, and you are vouched for by the Estonian government, and that assertion is signed with their digital signature. So there are ways of doing it, but again, they need to be built in the system, because otherwise someone's just asserting who they are, and you have to take that on trust. Where do you get the trust from? Right. What about money laundering then? This is leading to your point, lady at the back. We know that discovering who a customer is a slow offline process. That's what the law requires. There is no easy online way to do it. So ideally, it would be great if we could rely on what other people have done. In other words, once one bank has done all the KYC stuff on me, why can't other banks rely on that? That would be great. And that's something you can build into a blockchain technology, right, provided that other people in the system are allowed to rely on what my bank has done. Right. Now we can immediately see the problems for that. So the regulation needs to allow it, which it doesn't. At the moment, everybody has to independently do their own KYC, with some minor exceptions for payment transactions. Another thing that's quite interesting is KYC standards, because if you, I don't know how it works in France, but generally speaking, a big financial organization is pretty good at this, and small financial organizations take government guidance about know your customer and turn it into hard and fast rules. So there are many people in the UK who really can't identify themselves to bank accounts, to banks, because generally speaking they're too old. Right. So they've stopped driving, they no longer have a driving license, right, and they do have an address, so they're on the electoral roll, as we say, they're registered to vote, but they don't have a utility bill, because all their bills come electronically, and only printed bills mailed to you by the bank, by the utilities will count. So yeah, my mother is still driving, thank goodness, or otherwise they couldn't prove who they are to a bank, because they only have, they don't have the 3 pieces of identity they need. They've only got 2. They've got passports. Actually, they may no longer have passports because they're a bit old to travel. So in which case, they've got no passport. My mother has a driving license. My father hasn't got one anymore. And they've got no electricity bills because they come electronically. How are they going to prove who they are to a bank? Right. Yeah. And the small ones won't do it. So setting standards for this becomes important for the technology. How do you actually identify people? And there's clearly going to need to be international agreement between these things, because it's all very well me saying, my bank has identified me. That's fine in the UK. My bank is well known in the UK. It's probably well known in France because it's Barclays Bank, which is quite a big one. But if it was one of the smaller banks, you might never have heard of it here. Yeah, it might have no operations outside the UK. So how do we deal with international money laundering and KYC, particularly when, how can we put this? Some financial regulatory systems are more lax than others. You know, as an example, I would imagine the Syrian financial regulator at the moment is not working at top efficiency. Right. There's other stuff going on in Syria that's distracting everybody from effective identification. Right. And so, you know, we need to think about these things in this kind of system. But having said that, Deloitte have done some research and set out a white paper about how collaborative KYC could be done. And you can see that the blockchain might actually deal with just this thing alone, which would be a very useful thing to have. There are problems once, however, you identify people, because as soon as you identify people, you raise privacy and confidentiality concerns. Right. You've got big privacy concerns because now, if I've been buying shares and that's on the blockchain and anyone can read it, everybody knows my financial transactions. Right. That's a privacy issue. Right. If I'm a commercial organization, it's a big issue of commercial confidentiality. Yeah. Okay. So we have to think about obscuring these things. Do we actually separate the identification ledgers from the transactional ledgers, for example? Now, Bitcoin doesn't need to do that because there is no identification ledger. Right? Or do we use the technology to let the participant control their own identity disclosures? That is a concept called self-sovereign identity. It's quite an interesting theoretical concept that I actually think has some serious legal flaws, unfortunately, in it. But there is a section in my paper written by a very good student of mine who collaborated with me on it, and her work on that is really worth reading. And if you want the paper, you can get it from here, or just search for this paper on the Social Science Research Network, and the self-sovereign identity stuff is in there. Yeah. The problem is, just to try and satisfy your last bit, and again, over a glass of wine, maybe we can pick up some more. The big problem is this, that the idea is it lets you hold your identity information, all your attributes about you, like name, age, height, weight, income, address, yeah, mother's maiden name, yeah, where your father was born, all the stuff that might make up your identity. You control who has it, right, and decide who gets it, but once they get it, the controls then switch to contract, right? And that's the problem with it, right? But we can't make the technological controls go beyond once it's been handed over. Okay, more after if you want to talk about that. Right. Okay. I'm just checking the time because it is just before 7:45, so I haven't forgotten. Right. Drinks are soon. Right. What about this idea of third-party modification? Well, the idea of the Bitcoin ledger is no one can change it. The thing is immutable for all time, subject to Moore's law. You know, in Bitcoin time, it's immutable for the next couple of years, which is good enough for anybody. Right? But for off-chain assets, we need to be able to enforce court orders. We need to be able to enforce wills. There's a whole load of ways that entitlement could move around without somebody who will do a transaction. So we need a super user who can change the ledger. How are we going to cope with that? Well, the other reason we need one is, again, money laundering controls. Because if you're an intermediary, like a lawyer, an accountant, a notary, a banker, to whom the money laundering laws apply, and you become suspicious that money laundering might be involved in your transaction, you have to report it to whoever the authorities are, and you have to delay the transaction in accordance with their requirements. And you can't tell your client that that's what you're doing. You're not allowed to tip off the client the money laundering authorities are interested, and you commit a serious criminal offence if you do it. So at the moment it's nice and easy. You know, you're a lawyer, right? This thing hasn't happened. What's the obvious explanation? You're too busy and or lazy to have done it, and people will accept that, so you can get away with this for a bit. Yeah, it's incompetence. I'm sorry, it was, yeah, it's a more complex transaction. We had letters from the other side that I had to answer. I had to delay making the payment. That's all fine. On the ledger, right, you can see straight away what's happened and what hasn't happened. Right? It's an instantaneous change of record, near enough. So all these excuses disappear. Right? Right. So somebody needs to have that power to delay, and that's more difficult, I think, for all sorts of reasons. Right. Certainly, this is the big change I think is needed with any effective system for off-chain assets, is we now have to allow someone else to change the ledger. Yeah?
Do you remember the case of Silk Road?
Yes, I do indeed.
So, I mean, today, for example, if you buy any cryptocurrency on an exchange, you have to give your identity, except for a few of those, like Binance. But one, you have people's identity if you ask the exchanges. And second, Silk Road was stopped exactly because of that, because we can see the ledger. We could follow all the history from the beginning. So in a legal sense, that's good as well.
Yeah, well, to be fair, okay, the Bitcoin, the problem with Bitcoin from that perspective is the anonymization didn't work as well as they would have liked it to have worked. That was the biggest problem. The reason the exchanges asked for identity was a whole load of reasons, but one of them was that they wanted to become reputable businesses. To do that, they had to comply with money laundering laws. To do that, they had to ask who you were. Right. So they started capturing real-world identity. But that was a business decision. Yeah, it was the business decision that drove their legal compliance, not the legal obligation that drove them to do it.
That's right. I mean, your point is good, but maybe you didn't feel like that. I agree with your point, because precisely because once you have, I mean, it's crypto anarchists who create it.
Yeah,
so
yeah, absolutely.
It has to sort of have now a normal life application. So I agree with your point. It has to evolve. It has to.
Yeah, no, their problem was that they were good anarchists, but they weren't so good at crypto. That was their problem. They forgot about big data analysis. You know, if you throw enough data at the problem and just keep crunching it, eventually patterns come out, and that was how Silk Road was broken up, because that could identify the people involved, right, just by lots and lots of data crunching. In the same way, I have a friend, a computer scientist, who has a database of mobile telephone locations in London. And if you tell him 5 places that you were in the last week, places and times where you were, he can find your phone. He hasn't got the phone number, doesn't any identity. He can find your phone, tell you not only what you were doing last week, but predict what you're going to do next week as well. Yeah. So big data is very powerful. Yeah. And that's another problem with the blockchain, because you put all this transaction data out there, and then of course anybody who has access to it starts digging into it and mining it to find very interesting patterns. But just focusing on the legal requirements we have to make changes to registers, someone has to be able to do them. And I've called this person a super user. What kind of person are they going to be? Well, obviously, they've got to be trusted. I think they've got to be identified, because none of us could trust a system that said a secret but trustworthy person made changes. You know, that immediately makes you think, no. And also, you want them to have some independence from the transactions. Right? You don't want somebody who is interested in them going a particular way being allowed to make the changes. So that gives you a choice between the asset issuer. Yeah, in the case of a company, for example, if a company is registered for its own shares, are they independent? Are they trusted enough for companies? Probably, yeah. They're identified, certainly. Are they independent enough? Yeah. Usually, but then what if they have a majority shareholder who is also a major supplier? Oh, now we start to get potential conflicts of interest. So, you know, we have to think about that one. A regulator is probably trusted, certainly identified, certainly independent, meets all the requirements, but there are lots of other reasons why we might not want to get a regulator involved. Just because as soon as we get regulators involved, we get more regulation, and that slows things down. So, you know, if you're building the system, you might want to keep regulators out, at least to start with, or an independent third party. Where are you going to find an independent third party? Well, there are lots of possibilities. This sounds like, you know, a job for the notary, except that I don't think they'd step up to do it, because it's not a very it's a notary type thing that's going on here. That kind of organization potentially would have some of the qualifications, but maybe not the kind of commercial nous and technology savvy that you would want, but they could, I guess, learn that. And then how do you do it? Right. Well, I thought about this and I thought, okay, if where I started in terms of law was evidence, if the evidence of the ledger is fundamental, then the one thing you don't want is invisible changes to the ledger. Because if anybody can make invisible changes, you can't trust it anymore. So the super user has to do everything by a reversing transaction. So if the fraudster has obtained shares from me, the super user has to be able to initiate a transfer from the fraudster back to me. Right? And both those appear in the ledger. So yeah, I've been defrauded, the fraudster got the shares, but the super user transferred them back. And then we can trust the ledger because we can see what's happened. We haven't got hidden transactions that are going on. But it would mean quite a big change of regulatory focus for things like money laundering laws, because at this point, intermediaries don't have the power to do the things that the law wants them to do. Right? They can't stop transactions, they can't delay them, only the super user can do it. So it will change our regulatory focus from people like lawyers and bankers to the people who have the power to change registers. They're the ones on whom regulation is likely to bite. So, conclusions, with 10 minutes to run. So we're doing all right here. Okay, Bitcoin is about technological purity. Right, leaving mining aside. I get very cross about mining, but okay, leaving that aside, yeah, technologically pure, there's nothing happens in Bitcoin that's not technologically necessary. Right? But if we wanted a technologically pure blockchain system for off-chain assets, then we've got an awful lot of legal change required. And we can't do what commercial lawyers usually do and say, okay, let's redefine everything through contract. You can do a lot through contract. The Bolero organization does electronic transfer of shipping documents, and it has a long contract which effectively replicates international shipping law, right, and rewrites it in contractual terms. And I've actually reviewed the whole thing. Oh, I'm very impressed with it. It's really good. It's very boring and tedious, but it's really very good. It does it. So in a closed group like that, you can do these things. But we can't rewrite money laundering law through contract. We can't contract out of money laundering law. We can't contract out of financial services supervision. We can't contract out of audit requirements. These are external things that are imposed on us. Right. And that's because the people we're talking about who have rights or potential interests are external to the system. If it was just all the players, we could have a contractual network of regulation, and that would do it probably. Right. So we could change the law to make technologically pure blockchain possible, right? Which would mean things like abolishing money laundering. Now, I don't know how you feel about that. Ambivalent, I would guess, right? Yeah. But I'll tell you now that if you go to a government and you say, we're thinking of abolishing money laundering law, you're probably not going to get a very reliable answer. And we'd also have a completely new concept of property ownership, because in almost every country, property ownership is linked heavily with possession. Right? If you possess something, that gives you rights in it. Right? And we can kind of see that. You know, you hire a car. Right? It doesn't become your car, but for the hire period, you have rights in that car. The owner can't come and take it away from you. If they do, you can sue them for damages. So possession is important. Right? But if we were to say, the blockchain is the definitive record of all the rights, we now have to record car hire, as well as car maintenance, as well as new tires, as well as everything. So, you know, we'd be very much changing all the legal concepts that we're comfortable working with as a society. Might be worth doing in some areas, but not all of them, I think. Right. And so kind of the higher, more academic level, if you like, I think I'm arguing that legal impurities are just a necessary, an intrinsic consequence of things existing outside the blockchain. Right. If things exist in the real world, then the real world is going to impinge on your technology. You can't pretend that the rest of the world doesn't exist. Right. And one of the reasons for this is they regulate human interactions. And human interactions are messy and they're not easily computable. Right. And people spend a lot of time trying to compute human interactions, and yeah, it's so-so. So I was reading on the newspaper this morning as I came over that a supermarket in Edinburgh, a very small chain of supermarkets, had got a robot assistant to come in to help guide customers to the shelves, and it had a few problems. It didn't interact with the customers nearly as well, and it was particularly bad at persuading them to try new foods. So a human could persuade 15 people in the same time the robot could persuade 2 people. So it got sacked. And they were all very sad to see it go. But you know, it's better than last year's robot, so they're coming, but we still can't do it yet. Human interactions are difficult. Which means that if you want to use this technology for all the benefits it can bring, we're talking about compromises between technologists and lawyers. It's not simply a case of, okay, here's the technology, lawyers make it work. That's probably not possible. On the other hand, I don't think it can ever be a case of, here is some law, the law says no, so technology go away and stop playing in this field, because we know from experience that has not deterred them. Yeah. Technologists love finding ways around things. Right. They say, here's an obstacle. That's great. We'll compute around it. And the whole of e-commerce, cryptography, techno-law is a history of an arms race between technologists and the law, and sometimes one wins, sometimes the other. This is one where you'd be looking for cooperation. That actually, if your company is looking to get involved in this technology, to use it in some helpful way, you probably have to be involved in the design of it, not just the assessment a week before it's supposed to go live when they want to sign a contract. Right. You need to be in on it up front, helping to spec it and to actually work with the technologist to make sure it's built right. And that's a big challenge, because in my career, when I've done legal advice, I've tried to get in early, and the clients are never happy about getting lawyers in till the last minute. Right. That's our job, right? Last minute. Yeah. Quick read of these documents, make any last-minute changes, negotiate the exclusion of liability clause, and let us sign it off on Monday. Right, we've all heard that one. Yes, that's why it's our fault when the deal goes wrong. Right. This is one where you have to be in on the ground floor, helping to actually design the thing, to build in the legal impurities that you're going to want for this technology. Right. Okay, we have a question. There we are. And that was the finish. That was the kind of big flourish, and so sort of.
I'm coming back on what you said regarding the compromise we may have regarding between technology people and lawyers to make it work. Isn't it something maybe that may never happen? Because I think that's my view that the people who made that they try to make something. I have French word coming, anarchist. So it's kind of, they are trying to get rid maybe of the law, and on our side we are trying to compromise with them. Isn't it something maybe kind of 2 ways? Techniques may have their ways to try to get far from the law, and on our side we try to get closer to them. Isn't it something maybe that may not work?
It doesn't have to be an adversarial relationship. I really think it's a matter of timing. If they've already done the design and they've fallen in love with their technology and then you tell them to change it, they don't like you, right? Whereas if they're designing it and you say, do you know, if you changed it like this, it would be even better because it would meet this legal requirement and you'd sell more of it, they love you. Right? So it's really a question of when you get in the discussion. Right? If you're in it at the wrong point, then you're an obstacle and you're not popular.
About this point, how do you compare internet and the new technology of internet with this technology of blockchain?
Right. For those of the
about hierarchies, and it was the way they thought internet at the beginning.
Oh, I see. Yes. Yeah. No, I can see. So can I rephrase the question so the people at the back can hear what it is, and also then you can tell me if I got it right? Yeah. So the kind of almost philosophical aims of building the internet in the first place were quite similar to this. The idea being that the internet would root round damage. Is that what you're getting at? Yeah. That was how it was put by the designers at the time. And interestingly, of course, the design came out of the US defense sector. It was a Defense Advanced Research Projects idea. And the idea was that they wanted to invent a computer network where if a nuclear bomb fell on one city, the rest of the network would continue working and data would still find its way around it. And so the original internet design was designed exactly so that if, say, country A decided to try and block a particular piece of content, the content would try every other possible route to get to its destination and quite likely route around country A. Yeah, I can see why you can kind of see the conceptual similarities, but I don't think they're quite the same. The idea of routing around damage was an idea of keeping the network working in spite of the unexpected events, nuclear bombs, earthquakes, fires, whatever it might be. The idea behind Bitcoin was dealing with expected events. Yeah, the expected event was that governments would look at this and go, it's money or something like it. We want to control it. We want a monopoly over it. We want to know who's got it for tax purposes and other purposes. And it was a complete aim to just remove the law completely from the equation. I don't think that was a consideration of the original designers. They wanted, from their point of view, a highly lawful internet that would do what the instructions said, but had the kind of self-healing property of sealing off an area of damage and still working around it. But I have to think about that some more. It's a kind of interesting thought. Yeah. Okay, we've got now, hang on, we've got, right. We've got, yeah, I'm thinking, you've had two, so you're out, I'm sorry, because it's drinks in 2 minutes. We've got a lady at the back who hasn't had a question.
Just one question. All the presentation, of course, was made in a legal perspective.
Yeah.
But what happens if gang through a dark pool use blockchain systems?
Sorry, what happens if?
If a gang use the blockchain system through a dark pool.
Oh, yeah, you mean criminals decide to use the technology? Yeah, they do. It's great for criminals. It's lovely. It's really good technology for them. Yes. Yeah, it's the same way. Criminals have done this throughout history. You know, we invent the motor car, and goodness me, criminals are driving off from robberies using motor cars. Yeah, that happens. But you know, I'm not sure what the question from that is. So do we ban the technology? No, wouldn't work. Do we train up our law enforcement people to help find the criminals? Yes, we do. And guess what? With Silk Road, that kind of worked. And they used the big data technologies to identify people, partly using Bitcoin ledgers as part of the data. So, yeah, like all technologies, I'm not a technological evangelist. Technology is not always brilliant. But I'm certainly not a pessimist. It's not always bad either. And you know why? It's used by humans, who are, I think I may have mentioned, messy and not computable. Right. That kind of feels like the end to me. Yeah? And the clock says 8 o'clock. Shall we stop there? Thank you very much.